There are many reasons for an aircraft to fail, or otherwise end up as nothing more than a footnote in aviation history. Some aircraft are overtaken by fast-changing technology, becoming obsolete almost the moment that they leave the factory. Some are crippled by their intended power plant being delayed, or worse, never appearing at all. Some are hobbled by official requirements that are either too specific or hopelessly contradictory, and some are just bad, poorly designed. Today, we are looking at the Savoia-Marchetti SM.85. This is an aircraft I genuinely struggled to find sources for, as most simply refer to this as being a short-lived Italian dive bomber destined to be quickly replaced by the German-built Junkers Ju-87. But the story of this aircraft, although brief and filled with some truly embarrassing episodes, is still one worth discussing, if only for the amusement factor. In the 1930s, Italy's armed forces were undergoing a period of rapid modernization, and the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, required a new dive bomber. Traditional level bombing required precise timing if trying to hit a target with any sort of accuracy. Although suitable against large structures or groups of enemies, hitting small targets such as individual bunkers, tanks, or ships was extremely difficult. One solution was dive bombing. By putting the aircraft into a steep dive, the pilot could better judge the bomb's trajectory and achieve far greater precision. The challenge, however, was building an aircraft strong enough to survive not only just the dive itself, but also the recovery. Early biplanes were limited in both structure and bomb load, but as the decade went on, several nations began fielding monoplane dive bombers with real success, and Italy was determined not to fall behind. Thus, in 1935, the Regia Aeronautica issued a specification for just such an aircraft. It called for a single-seat, twin-engine design with excellent visibility and even a glass cutout in the cockpit floor to aid in target spotting. In other respects, though, engine type, speed, weight, and ordnance capacity, the requirements were remarkably vague. Despite being unclear about what exactly they wanted, the Regia Aeronautica had grand dreams of a full regiment of these aircraft. The challenge of producing this machine was taken up by the Savoia-Marchetti Aviation Company, which had already produced many successful designs, including several that we've already looked at on this channel. Their proposal for the new dive bomber was, on paper, quite modern. It featured a fully enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear. The fuselage was shaped as a compromise between pilot visibility and aerodynamic efficiency, producing a short, curving profile that later on earned the aircraft its nickname the banana with wings. To maximize the pilot's field of view, the cockpit was pushed right to the front of the nose, complete with a glazed cutout in the floor, just as the Air Force had requested. In other respects, however, the SM-85 already looked dated. Although fully enclosed, it had no heating system, and so high-altitude flight was going to be a very chilly prospect for the pilots. Structurally, it also lagged behind contemporary trends. At a time when the aviation world was shifting decisively towards all-metal airframes, the SM-85 was built largely of wood. Both its three-spar wings and its fuselage were wooden and covered with a mix of plywood and fabric. And speaking of somewhat old-school design, though the main landing gears did retract, the tail ended in nothing more than a rubber-braced skid. Power was another weakness. The aircraft was equipped with two Piaggio P7C16 7-cylinder radial engines, each driving a 3-blade variable-pitch metal propeller. These power plants were modest. Combined, they produced just 920 horsepower, hardly impressive for a twin-engine combat aircraft of the mid to late 1930s, and the armament was scarcely better. Although it technically had forward-firing weaponry, a single fuselage-mounted 7.7mm machine gun was more of a suggestion of firepower than an actual threat. That last point could perhaps have been forgiven, though. Many aircraft of the 30s entered service with limited armament and protection. What would prove more troubling was how poorly suited this dive bomber was to, well, dive bombing. In the interest of reducing drag and thus increasing performance, the bombs were only to be stored within an internal bomb bay. The size of this limited the SM-85 to a maximum payload of just one 500 or 800 kilogram bomb or a pair of 250 kilogram bombs. This was still reasonable in the 1930s, but a key part of dive bombing was the ability to control speed in the dive. The modern approach for the 1930s, as seen on the Ju-87, was to use specialized dive grills to increase drag whilst maintaining stability. The SM-85, on the other hand, simply relied on lowering its flaps a full 90 degrees into the slipstream to serve as dive brakes. Although these worked, they would make the dive significantly harder to control. This would be a bit of an issue, as keeping a steady dive was somewhat required for the whole accurate bombing thing. Practical issues further compounded the design's shortcomings. The placement of the engines, mounted on the wings immediately beside the cockpit, did give excellent forward visibility, but it also made entering the aircraft remarkably awkward. The pilot would have to crawl along the back of the fuselage to reach the cockpit, a procedure that would lead to at least two incidents, one involving a pilot and a mechanic both slipping and falling during preparations. For safety, the engines could only be started once the pilot was in the cockpit. Now, if you are wondering how the pilot would bail out, what with the three spinning blades either side of the only exit, the response seems to have been to be very careful and to say a prayer. Despite all of this, the Regia Aeronautica was still desperate for a domestically produced dive bomber, and so they ordered a prototype. This was constructed and took its maiden flight on the 19th of December 1936. The results were far from promising. In addition to all the issues already mentioned, its terrible climb performance became readily apparent. Even when carrying only a single 250 kilogram bomb, the lightest load it could manage, the SM-85 climbed at less than 2 meters per second. To reach its service ceiling of 6,500 meters, or about 21,300 feet, required a steady climb of roughly 45 minutes. Its performance in level flight was a little better, but it didn't set any speed records. Maximum speed was 368 km per hour, or 229 miles an hour, with a cruising speed of just 278 km an hour. Now, even by mid-1930s standards, this was only just passable for a modern frontline aircraft. Now, if nearly an hour to climb to altitude sounded bad, pilots were then met with a harrowing experience when diving. The flaps, pressed into service as makeshift dive brakes, created severe instability when deployed. The aircraft tended to oscillate violently along its longitudinal axis, making it nearly impossible to hold anything like a steady aim. Worse still was the aircraft's painfully slow dive recovery, which meant that the pilot had to drop the bomb and start the dive recovery while still well above the target, further reducing accuracy. And as if all of that was not enough, it turned out the unique airframe design was structurally weak. So weak that if a SM-85 landed after a failed sortie without dropping its bombs, the force of said landing risked damaging the airframe permanently. And yet, despite these issues, the Regia Aeronautica still pressed on. A second prototype was ordered, followed by a small production run of 10 aircraft, which was later increased to 33 in total. These featured redesigned flaps, though the improvements to dive handling were marginal at best, and the armament was also updated, with the option of two 7.7mm nose-mounted machine guns or a single 12.7mm weapon. Better than the prototype, but only just. Despite all of its flaws, the SM-85 was still rolled out for public display. At the 17th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the Regia Aeronautica, 9 examples flew in formation, drawing admiration from the crowd, who, conveniently, did not see what happened when the aircraft actually attempted a dive. The bombers were then assigned to the 96th Group of Dive Bombers at Roma Ciampino Airfield, where training began. Unfortunately, the poor flight characteristics of the type would quickly have effect, killing a pilot during an early training exercise. Not much is known about its domestic service history, which says a lot, but it is known that the type was generally unpopular. In April of 1940, Chief of Staff Francesco Priccolo came in person to observe tests with live ordnance. What he saw was damning. The aircraft's dives were unstable, marked by sudden changes in speed and painfully slow recoveries. Accuracy, the entire justification for the dive bombing role in the first place, was virtually non-existent, and even worse, the sluggish pullout from the dive left the SM-85s hanging in the air, an easy target for ground fire, which was a particularly dangerous prospect for an aircraft built mostly out of wood and fabric. Attempts were made to salvage the design with the improved SM-86. This prototype was fitted with two 750 horsepower Isotta Fraschini Delta RC-40s, which were 12-cylinder inverted Vs. Its fuselage was refined and the canopy reshaped from a bulbous nose to a razorback, trading visibility for better aerodynamics. This resulted in a speed increase to 412 km per hour, but by this point the Regia Aeronautica had already made up its mind, and both the SM-85 and the SM-86 would be cancelled. The already built SM-85s were still deployed just ahead of Italy's entry into the Second World War, for a brief stint on the front lines that was as disastrous as its design phase. Divided into the 236th and 237th squadrons, the SM-85s were transferred to Pantelleria, a small island between Tunisia and Sicily. The first incident occurred as the unit initially arrived. The transfer flight had approached at sea level, but the island's airfield was located at a modest elevation of 194 meters, or about 635 feet. Even that climb was apparently a challenge for the SM-85. Lieutenant Ettore Marcosi, commander of the 236th Squadron, struck a wall at the end of the runway while trying to bring his aircraft in. The crash nearly completely destroyed the plane and left Marcosi badly injured, forcing his medical evacuation. He survived his wounds thanks to Sergeant Flamini, who flew him to the mainland in an SM-81 transport, despite having no formal training on the type. Apparently, once you could handle the SM-85, every other aircraft felt manageable by comparison. The single record of a combat operation involving an SM-85 is somehow the most farcical part of the entire history of this ill-fated dive bomber. The bombers were tasked with intercepting shipping heading for the nearby island of Malta. The first sortie was cancelled before takeoff due to organisational issues, likely a blessing, but the second was less fortunate. 3 aircraft took off to intercept a set of ships that had been reported. They were unable to locate their targets, and running low on fuel, they returned to base. Each had a 500-kilogram bomb, which, as we discussed, would have to be jettisoned before landing to avoid damaging the fragile airframe. These could have been dropped in the open sea, but it was decided to drop them near the shore of Pantelleria in the hopes that the blast from the bombs would stun or kill some fish, which could then be collected later for dinner. Unfortunately, the island's air defense crews had not been trained to recognize friendly aircraft. All they saw were 3 planes making low passes and dropping ordnance offshore. Believing themselves under attack, they opened fire. Luckily, they were as bad as aiming as they were at telling friend from foe, and so there were no non-fish casualties in that incident. The 3 SM-85s had to circle overhead, dodging enthusiastic but ineffective flak, until their comrades on the ground could run from the airfield to the gun crews and convince them to cease fire on their own countrymen. As there are no details on how many fish were killed in this incident, the final kill count of the SM-85 will forever remain a mystery. Its service did not last much longer after this, as one final flaw ended any hope of longevity. At night, the SM-85s were stored in caves for protection. Alternating between these damp caves at night and the Tunisian sun during the day soon had their effects, and within a month the wooden airframes had begun to warp, particularly the ailerons. This grounded many of the remaining aircraft. On the 16th of July 1940, the group was formally withdrawn and it would be retrained on the Ju-87B Stuka, becoming the first unit in the Regia Aeronautica to qualify for the type. And ultimately, that is where the story of the SM-85 ended. The remaining SM-85s rotted away, ending a rather embarrassing episode in Savoia-Marchetti's history. The Regia Aeronautica had decided to abandon the dream of a domestic dive bomber and moved over fully onto the German-built Stuka, which it would fly to great success. The Stuka was smaller, more rugged, had better performance, and importantly, it could actually dive bomb. But the story of that iconic aircraft will have to wait for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members whose support helps keep the channel going. And of course, a very special thank you to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members. Now, owing to growing professional commitments, I'm bringing in some very kind people to help manage almost all of the video editing moving forward. This will allow me to keep up with the research and writing without further slowing down an already reduced upload schedule. As such, there may be some slight fluctuations in editing style over the next few weeks as we settle into things, but overall the style of the videos will not be changing, so don't panic there. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the pinned comment below, and if you're new here, or just stumble on this video thanks to the algorithm, I'd encourage you to take a look through the back catalogue as there are plenty of other videos, deep dives, guides, and other random bits of aviation history waiting for you. And if you enjoy what you see and you've made it this far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. For now though, thank you all once again for your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.